Eliza Mercer stood in a courtroom with bruises she didn't bother to hide. Across the aisle, the man who'd bought her for $200 smiled at her. It was the worst thing he could have done, because this time she smiled back. But to understand how a factory girl from Ohio ended up staring down the most dangerous man in Montana territory, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment her knees hit the dirt. Eliza Mercer stood in a courtroom she had no right to be in, wearing a dress that wasn't hers with bruises she didn't bother to hide. The judge sat behind his bench with wire spectacles and soft hands that had never held a rope or a rifle. But his eyes were sharp, the kind of eyes that cut through bluster and landed on bone. 50 people packed the gallery: cowboys, merchants, women in bonnets, a reporter from the Yellowstone Journal with a pencil behind his ear, all of them watching a woman in a borrowed brown dress who looked like she'd been dragged through hell and walked back out the front door. Across the aisle, a man sat with a hired lawyer from Billings. Big man, black hat off, gold ring on his right hand, red-eyed, unshaved, smaller without the hat, diminished. But his eyes found hers across the room and he smiled. It was the worst thing he could have done, because Eliza looked at that smile, the same smile he'd worn while dragging her across a boardwalk, while raising his fist while telling her she was property, and she felt every last trace of fear burn out of her body like frost under a July sun. She stood, no lawyer, no advocate, just a woman with a split lip that had healed crooked and a voice that didn't shake. "I was bought, Your Honor, not married." The man across the aisle surged to his feet. His lawyer grabbed his arm. He shook it off like a dog shaking water. "She's mine. I paid $200. Behind Eliza near the courtroom door, a man stood with his hat in his hands. Tall, quiet, a blue work shirt beneath a brown leather vest, both worn soft by years of wind and sun and rain. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there the way he'd stood at the end of a dusty street in a town called Copper Bluff 6 weeks earlier, when no one else in the world had moved an inch for the woman now standing before a judge. But to understand how a factory girl from Ohio ended up in a territorial courthouse with dust in her hair and fire in her throat, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to a Tuesday in July when the heat pressed down on Montana like a hot iron on linen, and a wagon rolled into a town that God had already forgotten. Back to the moment Eliza Mercer's knees hit the dirt. This is the story of a woman who was sold for $200, beaten in front of 40 people, and hunted across 137 miles of open prairie. She had 60 days. 60 days before the contract that bound her became a chain no judge could break. And in those 60 days, she would learn to ride, learn to fight, learn to read the law that was written to keep her silent, and she would stand in front of the most dangerous man she'd ever known and tell him to his face that he did not own her. But first, she had to survive the fall. 6 weeks earlier, in a textile mill on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, a woman stood at a loom for 14 hours and bled into the thread. Eliza Mercer was 23 years old. Her hands were cracked from the chemicals. Her lungs burned from the cotton dust that hung in the air like fog that never lifted. She coughed every morning, deep, wet coughs that left red spots on her handkerchief. The foreman didn't care. The other women didn't look. Everyone in that mill was dying by inches, and the only question was whether you'd last long enough to collect your wages on Friday. She'd been at the mill since she was 16. 7 years of standing in the same spot feeding thread into a machine that ate fingers if you blinked. 2 women on her floor had lost hands. 1 had lost an eye. The mill paid for nothing. No doctor, no time off, no sympathy. Just another body at the loom, and if that body broke, there were 20 more lined up outside the door waiting to take its place. Her mother had died the winter before. Consumption. The same disease the mill was slowly feeding into Eliza's lungs, 1 cotton fiber at a time. Her father had been gone since she was 9. Walked out one morning to buy tobacco and never came home. No letter, no explanation. Just an empty chair at the table, and a mother who stopped smiling and never started again. So when Eliza coughed into her handkerchief and saw the red spots growing larger each week, she understood with perfect clarity that the mill wasn't just taking her labor. It was taking her life, 1 shift at a time, 1 breath at a time. And if she didn't leave, she would die in this building and no one would notice except the foreman who would have her loom filled by the next morning. On a Tuesday evening in April, Eliza walked home to her boarding house and found a letter on her bed. Not from family, she had none left. from a marriage broker in St. Louis. The letter described a man named Silas Dorn, a successful rancher in Montana Territory. Good moral character, Christian upbringing, looking for a wife of modest disposition and strong work ethic, willing to pay all transportation costs plus a broker's fee of $200. $200, more money than Eliza would see in a year at the mill. She read the letter 3 times. She read the contract that came with it, a single page of small print that described terms and conditions and obligations. She read it the way a drowning woman reads a rope thrown from shore. Not carefully, not critically, with the desperate eyes of someone who needed it to be real. She signed her name at the bottom on a Wednesday morning before her shift. By Thursday, she was on a train heading west. She left behind a loom, a boarding house bed, and a handkerchief with blood spots she'd stopped trying to wash out. She didn't know what waited for her in Montana. She only knew what she was leaving. And at 23, with ruined lungs and cracked hands and no family left alive, leaving felt like the only kind of living she had left. The wagon rolled into Copper Bluff on a Tuesday. July heat pressed down on the town like a blacksmith's hammer on soft iron. Eliza sat in the back with her one trunk and the marriage contract folded inside her Bible. She hadn't eaten since Missouri, hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since Kansas. The land had changed outside the wagon. Green had turned to gold hills, to flatland trees, to nothing but grass and sky, stretching out in every direction like the earth had forgotten to put up walls. The driver was a man named Guthrie who chewed tobacco and never once asked her name. He pulled the mules to a stop in front of a dry goods store and spat a brown stream into the dust. "This is it. Get down." Eliza stood. Her legs shook. She grabbed the side of the wagon to steady herself and looked out at the town she'd agreed to call home. Copper Bluff wasn't much. A single dirt road wide enough for 2 wagons, a saloon with no door, a church with a steeple that leaned like a man who'd had too much to drink, a blacksmith shop belching smoke from a chimney that needed patching. And people, maybe 40 of them, standing along the boardwalk on both sides of the street, watching her the way men watch livestock at auction, measuring, appraising, deciding what she was worth before she'd spoken a single word. A man pushed through the crowd, tall, thick-armed, black hat pulled low over a face that might have been handsome once before the whiskey carved it into something harder. A gold ring on his right hand, not a wedding band. A signet ring heavy with a flat face that caught the light like a warning. Silas Dorn. He walked to the wagon and looked her up and down, slowly, the way a man inspects a horse he's not sure was worth the price. "You're smaller than the photograph." Eliza opened her mouth to speak. His hand came first. The back of that gold ring caught her across the cheekbone. The sound was sharp and flat like a branch breaking. Her head snapped sideways. Her feet left the wagon step. She hit the ground on both knees and the dust rose around her skirt in a cloud that tasted like copper and drier earth. Blood ran warm from her lip to her chin. A woman on the boardwalk gasped, then covered her mouth. A child pulled at his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why'd he hit her?" The mother pulled the child close and said nothing. A man in the doorway of the saloon looked at his boots. The blacksmith Holt leaned against his doorframe with his arms folded and his face empty. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 40 people stood on that street and watched a man knock a woman to the ground, and not a single soul stepped forward. Silas grabbed Eliza by the arm and hauled her to her feet. His fingers dug into her skin hard enough to leave bruises shaped like a man's grip. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, hot and sour even in the open air. "I paid 6 months' wages for you," he said loud enough for every ear on the street to hear. 6 months, and they send me this. Eliza's legs buckled, but she didn't fall again. She pressed her hand against her bleeding lip and looked at the ground. The dust was already turning dark where her blood had dripped. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You will be." He dragged her toward his wagon at the far end of the street. Her trunk stayed behind in the dirt. Nobody picked it up. Nobody looked at her. The town of Copper Bluff turned its eyes away from Eliza Mercer the same way it turned its eyes away from everything that was ugly and true and too costly to confront. But not everyone. At the far end of the street near the water trough where the road curved toward open prairie, a man stood watching. He leaned against a fence post with his arms crossed. A blue work shirt faded at the elbows beneath a brown leather vest that had seen more trail dust than most men see in a lifetime. His hat was wide-brimmed and pulled low, but not low enough to hide his eyes, dark, steady, unblinking. A single eagle feather was tied to a leather cord around his left wrist. His jaw was set like it had been carved from the same stone as the land around him. Caleb Slade. He watched Silas drag Eliza to the wagon. He watched the town do nothing. He watched 40 people become accomplices to a crime that none of them would call a crime because a man who paid $200 for a woman believed he'd bought the right to break her. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look away. Holt the blacksmith noticed him standing there and spat into the dirt. "Ain't your business, drifter. Move along." Caleb's eyes shifted to Holt. Slow, steady, the kind of look that made men suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. Holt held for a second, maybe two, then turned and went back inside his shop. The wagon carried Eliza out of town. The dust settled behind it, and the cowboy in the brown leather vest stood at that fence post for a long time after everyone else had gone inside, watching the road that led south towards Silas Dorn's ranch. Watching, not moving, not looking away. Silas Dorn's cabin sat 3 miles outside Copper Bluff on a stretch of land that looked like God had started building something and walked away halfway through. 2 rooms, a stove that didn't draw right, so the cabin always smelled like smoke and old grease. A bed Eliza would rather die than share. A table with a knife mark in the wood from some argument she didn't want to imagine. That first night, Silas sat across from her and ate salt pork with his fingers. He pointed the knife at her the way a man points at a dog that's misbehaved. Rules. Eliza folded her hands in her lap. "You cook, you clean, you don't talk to nobody in town unless I say so. You don't ride. You don't leave this property." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "And you sure as hell don't embarrass me again." "I didn't." "You fell." He slammed the knife into the table. The blade stuck quivering 2 inches from her wrist. "In front of the whole town, you fell like some helpless animal. Made me look like I married a child." Eliza stared at the knife. "You hit me," she said quietly. The chair screeched as he stood. He walked around the table, slow, deliberate, and grabbed the back of her neck. His hand was huge, his fingers wrapped around her throat like they were built for exactly this purpose. "You were hit because you earned it." His breath was hot and foul against her ear. "Don't earn it again." He let go and walked to the door. Dishes, then bed. The door slammed. Eliza sat in the silence for a long time. Her hands trembled. Her cheekbone throbbed. She could taste copper on her tongue. She looked at the knife still stuck in the table. She didn't pull it out. Not yet. 3 days passed. Eliza learned the rhythm of Silas Dorn's cruelty the way a person learns the sound of approaching thunder. Not because they want to, but because survival depends on it. He was worst in the mornings. Before coffee, before whiskey dulled whatever burned inside him. He'd find a reason. Eggs too runny, shirt not pressed flat enough, a look on her face he decided was disrespect. The back of his hand, the flat of his palm. Once the heel of his boot when she was too slow getting up from the floor. She learned to keep her eyes down, hands busy, mouth shut. She learned which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't. She learned that the window in the back room could be opened without sound if you lifted the frame before you pushed. She learned these things the way animals learn the edges of a cage. Not to escape, just to know where the walls were. On the 4th morning, she walked to the well behind the cabin to draw water. The sun was barely up. The prairie stretched out in every direction, gold and endless, and for a moment, standing there with a bucket in her hand, Eliza felt so small and so alone that the land itself seemed to be swallowing her. Then she saw him. 200 yards out near the tree line where cottonwoods followed the curve of a creek, a man sat on a horse, still as the land itself. Blue shirt, brown vest, hat pulled low. The cowboy from the street, Caleb Slade. He wasn't watching her exactly. He was watching the cabin, the property, the road that led back to town, the way a man watches something he's already decided matters. Eliza froze with the bucket in her hand. They looked at each other across that distance. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The morning air was still, and the only sound was the creak of the well rope in the wind. Then the cowboy's horse sneezed. A big, wet, ungraceful sound that shattered the stillness like a rock through a window. The horse shook its head and stamped, and for a single second, the mystique of the silent stranger evaporated completely. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't react. Just turned his horse east and rode toward the river without changing expression, as if the animal beneath him hadn't just undermined 6 minutes of perfect dramatic tension. Eliza stood at the well and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd stepped off that wagon. A smile, small, involuntary, gone almost before it arrived. But real, the first real smile since Montana. She drew her water and went back inside. She didn't mention it to Silas. Saturday came. Silas drove her into town for supplies. He kept a hand on her arm the whole time, steering her through the store like she was a mule that might bolt. The shopkeeper, a woman named Agnes Holden, weighed flour and sugar without looking at Eliza's bruised face. "Fine morning, Mrs. Dorn." Eliza didn't correct her. She wasn't Mrs. Dorn. She'd never stood before a preacher. She was a contract, a transaction, paper and ink, and 6 months' wages. But she nodded. "Fine morning." Silas bought whiskey, 2 bottles. He told Eliza to carry both while he settled his account. Outside, the sun hammered the dirt street white. Eliza stood by the wagon holding the bottles, her arms aching, her ribs sore where his boot had found them 3 days ago. A group of men sat outside the saloon. One of them, a rancher named Polk, called out, "Hey, Dorn, that bride of yours do any tricks?" Laughter. Silas grinned. "Still training her." More laughter. Eliza kept her eyes on the ground. Her fingers tightened around the bottlenecks until her knuckles went white. She focused on the dust, on the way the light hit the glass, on anything that wasn't the sound of men laughing about her like she was a dog that hadn't learned to sit yet. Then she felt it, that stillness again. She looked up. Caleb Slade stood near the blacksmith's shop, holding a set of iron tools he'd come to trade. He wasn't looking at the laughing men. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at Eliza. Not with pity. That was the part she'd remember later when she'd had time to think about it, to turn it over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand. He looked at her the way you look at a person. Not a thing, not property, not a joke. A person. And it hit her somewhere beneath her ribs, in a place she thought Silas Dorn had already killed. She was still a person. Polk saw where she was looking. "Hey, your woman's staring at the cowboy Dorn." The laughter stopped. Silas turned. His face went dark. He crossed the dirt in 3 strides, grabbed Eliza by the hair, and yanked her head back. "What did I tell you about eyes? I wasn't. Don't lie to me." He shoved her against the wagon wheel. Her spine cracked against the iron rim. She gasped but didn't cry out. The bottles fell from her hands and shattered in the dirt. Whiskey soaked into the dust like blood into a bandage. The whole street watched. Nobody said a word. Caleb set the iron tools down on the ground. Slowly, deliberately. Then he straightened to his full height. The blue shirt was visible beneath the open front of his brown vest, and his hands hung at his sides, open, empty. He took 1 step forward. Just one. 1 step in a town where no one had moved an inch for this woman since the day she arrived. Silas saw it. His hand went to the pistol on his belt. "Come on, Drifter. Give me a reason." Caleb didn't give him one. He stood there 1 step closer than before, his hands open at his sides, his eyes locked on Silas Dorn's face. No threat, no challenge, just presence. The simple, immovable presence of a man who had decided to be seen. The silence stretched. A horse stamped somewhere down the street. A fly buzzed around the spilled whiskey. Silas's fingers twitched on the pistol grip. Then Agnes Holden opened her shop door. "Mr. Dorn, you forgot your receipt." The moment broke. Silas pointed at Caleb. "Stay away from what's mine." He grabbed Eliza, threw her into the wagon, and drove out of town without looking back. Caleb watched the wagon disappear down the road. Then he picked up his tools, paid the blacksmith, and walked east with the easy stride of a man who had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. The men outside the saloon went back to their drinks. Agnes closed her door. The street went quiet. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. That night, Eliza lay in bed and listened to Silas snore in the next room. Her back ached where the wagon wheel had caught her spine. Her scalp burned where he'd grabbed her hair. Her lip was bleeding again, where the old wound had cracked open. She stared at the ceiling and thought about that one step forward. In a town full of men who prided themselves on courage and honor and the code of the West, and not one of them had moved a boot heel for her. Not the blacksmith, not the shopkeeper, not the deputy, not the preacher. Not a single solitary soul. But a cowboy in a brown leather vest, a man she didn't know whose name she'd never heard spoken, had set down his tools and stepped forward. And in that single step, he had drawn a line. Invisible, silent, but real as the ground under his boots. This far, no further. Eliza rolled onto her side and pulled the thin blanket to her chin. For the first time in Copper Bluff, she did not cry herself to sleep. She planned. Monday morning, Silas rode out to check his herd. He'd be gone until sundown. He told her twice before leaving, "Don't leave this cabin. Don't talk to nobody. I'll know if you do." The dust from his horse hadn't settled before Eliza was moving. She went to the trunk she'd brought from Ohio, the one nobody had picked up that first day in the street. She'd retrieved it from Guthrie's wagon after paying him with a silver brooch her mother had given her, the last thing she owned and that had any value beyond what a man in Montana had decided she was worth. She opened the trunk. Beneath her spare dress and her Bible, she found the contract. The letters from the marriage broker. The ones that described Silas Dorn as a man of good moral character and Christian upbringing. She read the contract again, not with the desperate eyes of a woman running from a factory that was killing her, with the sharp, cold, calculating eyes of a woman looking for a crack in the wall. And she found one. Clause 7, buried in the small print in language so dense it was clearly designed to be skipped. 5 lines of legal text that Silas Dorn had never read because Silas Dorn didn't read contracts. He read price tags. In the event that the terms of Christian marriage are not fulfilled within 60 days of arrival, the contract shall be reviewed by a licensed authority and may be rendered void. 60 days. She'd been in Copper Bluff for 11. No preacher had married them. No vows had been spoken. No ceremony had been performed. No certificate had been filed. Silas hadn't bothered. In his mind, the money was the marriage. $200 made her his property, and property didn't need a preacher's blessing. But the contract said otherwise. 49 days. Eliza folded the papers and slid them into the lining of her skirt. She closed the trunk. She swept the floor. She started the stew. She chopped the onions. She fed the fire. And when Silas came home at sundown, smelling of cattle and dust and the permanent stench of whiskey, she had his plate ready and his glass poured. He sat down and ate without looking at her. Halfway through, he grunted. "Good girl," Eliza smiled. It was the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. More dangerous than signing the contract. More dangerous than getting on the train. More dangerous than standing up after he'd knocked her down. Because this smile was a lie, and inside that lie was the beginning of something Silas Dorn could not see, could not hear, could not beat out of her. A plan, small and fragile and barely alive, but growing. 49 days. That same night in the saloon at the center of Copper Bluff, Silas Dorn sat at his usual table and drank whiskey he couldn't afford to keep buying. Polk sat across from him. Holt leaned against the bar. A few other men orbited the table the way small planets orbit something with more gravity than they have sense. "Something's off with that girl," Silas said. Polk spat on the floor. "Hit her a few more times, she'll settle." Silas shook his head. He turned the whiskey glass in his hand. The gold ring caught the lamplight and threw it across the table in a thin line. "Not that kind of off. She's quiet. She's always quiet. Not like this." Silas drank. His eyes were unfocused, staring at something none of them could see. "This is different. It's like, you know when a cat sits real still and watches a mouse, that kind of quiet. Like she knows something I don't." Polk laughed. "She's a mill girl from Ohio, Silas. She don't know nothing." "Maybe," Silas poured another glass. "But that cowboy, the drifter, he was at the blacksmith's again today, watching. Want us to run him off?" Silas lifted the glass to his lips. The whiskey burned going down, but not as much as it used to. Nothing burned as much as it used to. That was the problem with whiskey. You needed more and more of it to feel anything at all. "Not yet," he said, "but keep your eyes open. Something about that man. He looks at me like he already knows how this ends." He finished the glass and slammed it on the table. "Nobody knows how this ends but me." 49 days. The clock was running. And in a cabin 3 miles south of a town that had turned its back on her, a woman with a split lip and a cracked rib sat at a kitchen table and counted the days like ammunition. She didn't know the cowboy's name yet, didn't know where he came from or why he'd stepped forward when no one else had moved, didn't know that he'd lost someone too, that he carried his own dead the way she carried her bruises close to the skin in places no one else could see. She only knew what that one step meant. It meant she was visible. It meant that somewhere in this godforsaken stretch of dust and silence and cruelty, one person had looked at her and seen a human being. Not property, not a transaction, not a punchline, a person. And that was enough, not enough to save her. Nobody was going to save her. She'd learned that lesson in Ohio at the loom, watching women lose fingers while the foreman counted thread. Nobody saves you. You save yourself or you don't get saved. But it was enough to keep her counting. 49 days and a crack in the wall that no one else had seen. Eliza pressed her hand against the contract hidden in her skirt lining. The paper was warm from her body. She could feel the words through the fabric clause, 7 printed in ink, that some lawyer in St. Louis had never imagined would matter to anyone. It mattered now. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark, listening to the silence of the prairie and the distant sound of coyotes singing to a moon she couldn't see. Tomorrow she would find the cowboy. Tomorrow she would start building the case that would set her free. Tomorrow the woman who had been sold for $200 would begin buying herself back. But tonight she rested, not because she was tired, because she was awake, truly awake, for the first time in her life. And awake women are dangerous things. The next morning Eliza found something on the cabin step. A small piece of river stone, smooth and flat, warm from the early sun. Someone had carved a single mark into its surface with a steady hand. A bear paw. 5 toes and a wide pad cut shallow into gray stone the color of creek water. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It was perfectly round, the kind of stone you'd find only if you knew exactly where to look. Only if you'd spent years walking riverbeds and reading the ground the way other men read newspapers. Eliza closed her fingers around it. She didn't know what the bear paw meant. Not yet, but she knew who'd left it, and she knew it wasn't a love token. It wasn't an invitation. It was a message. I see you, I know what's happening. You are not alone. She slipped the stone into her pocket and went back inside. When Silas woke up and demanded his coffee, she poured it steady-handed and clear. You're quiet today, he said. Suspicious, always suspicious. The animal instinct of a man who controlled everything around him and could feel somewhere beneath the whiskey fog that something was slipping. Just tired, Eliza said. But she wasn't tired. For the first time in her life, Eliza Mercer was awake. 46 days left on the contract when she made her first real move. Silas rode out before dawn to meet a cattle buyer from Helena. He'd be gone 2 days, maybe 3. He left her with a bruise on her collarbone and a warning. I find out you left this property, I'll chain you to the stove. She waited until the sound of his horse faded to nothing. Then she pulled the river stone from her pocket, turned it over twice in her hand, and walked out the front door. She didn't know where Caleb Slade lived. The preacher's wife, Martha Pruitt, had mentioned him once in passing at the general store when Silas was settling accounts and Eliza had slipped to the church under the pretense of prayer. There's a cowboy, Martha had whispered, barely moving her lips. Trades with folks near the river. People say he knows the territorial court system. Worked as a translator at the Fort Laramie office years ago. And then the name dropped like a stone into still water. Caleb Slade. The river was east. Eliza had never walked more than 50 yards from the cabin alone. She walked 3 miles. Her boots weren't made for prairie ground. Her stockings soaked through with dew. Her dress caught on sagebrush and tore at the hem. The land stretched out around her in every direction, enormous and empty, and utterly indifferent to the small figure moving across it. A hawk circled overhead. The grass whispered against her skirt. The sun climbed and the heat settled on her shoulders like a hand pressing down. None of it mattered. She found the Woloka River by the sound of it. A low, steady rush through cottonwood trees whose leaves caught the light and turned it silver. She followed the bank south for half a mile until she smelled smoke. A small camp sat in a clearing. A canvas tent, old but well-maintained. A fire ring built from river stones. 3 horses tied to a rope line, their tails flicking at flies. Drying racks with strips of meat hanging in the warm air. The whole camp had the feel of a place that could be packed up and gone in 20 minutes if the need arose. Caleb Slade was kneeling by the fire scraping a deer hide with a bone tool. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and the blue work shirt was dark with sweat across the shoulders. The brown leather vest hung on a branch near the tent drying in the sun. His hat sat beside him on a flat rock. He looked up when she stepped into the clearing. His hand stopped moving. His expression didn't change. If he was surprised to see a white woman in a torn dress standing at the edge of his camp at 7 in the morning, breathing hard and holding a carved stone out in front of her like a ticket she'd been told to present, he didn't show it. "You left this," she said. Caleb set down the scraping tool and stood. He was taller than she remembered. His face was harder up close. Not cruel, but carved by weather and years of something she couldn't name yet. Something that lived behind his eyes the way fire lives behind a closed stove door. Contained but not gone. "I did," he said. "Why be mum? Because a bear stands its ground." Eliza lowered her hand. "I don't understand." "You will." She waited for more. He didn't offer it. He walked to the fire and poured water from a clay pot into a tin cup. He held it out to her. She took it, drank. Her hands were shaking, and she hated that he could see it. "Martha Pruitt told me your name," Eliza said. "She said you know about territorial law." Caleb sat down on a log near the fire. He gestured to a flat stone across from him. Eliza sat. "I translated for the Fort Laramie office," he said. 7 years. I read every treaty, every contract, every land agreement they pushed across the table." "Then you know what a marriage broker contract looks like." His eyes narrowed. "You have one." Eliza pulled the folded papers from her skirt lining and held them out. Caleb took them. He read slowly, carefully the way Martha had, but his finger didn't trace the lines. His eyes moved with the certainty of a man who'd read 1,000 documents meant to trap people in language they didn't understand. He stopped on clause 7. 60 days, he said. 46 now, no marriage performed, no preacher, no vows, nothing. Caleb folded the papers and handed them back. He looked at her, and his voice was quiet and level and carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then you're not his wife." The words hit Eliza like cold water poured over a fever. She'd known it, intellectually, legally. She'd known it since she found the clause. But hearing another person say it out loud, hearing a man's voice confirm what her own voice had been too afraid to speak, that was different. That was real. "I'm not his wife," she repeated. "No." "But he'll say I am. The town will back him. He paid money." "Money doesn't make marriage. Even Whitelaw knows that." Eliza pressed her palms against her knees. "Then what do I need?" "A witness who will swear no ceremony took place, a legal authority to review the contract, and enough time to get to the territorial court in Miles City before Silas figures out what you're doing." "Miles City is 140 miles. 137. I can't ride." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, not with judgment, with calculation, the look of a man measuring what a person was made of. "You'll learn," he said. Eliza's throat tightened. "Why are you helping me?" Caleb picked up the bone-scraping tool and turned it in his hands. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. The fire crackled between them. A horse on the line shifted and blew air through its nose. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, lower. The kind of low that comes not from trying to be quiet, but from speaking around something lodged deep in the throat. "My sister's name was Sarah. She was 16 when they traded her to a sergeant at Fort Keogh." He didn't look up. His hands worked the scraping tool against nothing, just muscle memory, something to do while the words came out. "It was a deal. The fort needed translators they could trust. I was good at the work, good enough that they wanted to keep me, but the commanding officer wanted collateral, insurance, something to make sure I didn't walk away in the middle of a treaty negotiation." He paused. "They wanted Sarah." Eliza couldn't move. "My father signed the papers because they told him it would protect our family. Give us standing. I signed because I believed him. Because I was 20 years old and I thought if I did everything right, if I worked hard enough and translated clean enough and kept my head down, the system would be fair." He scraped the bone tool against the log. Long, even strokes. The sound was dry and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Sarah lasted 2 winters. The sergeant drank. He hit her. He locked her in a root cellar when she talked back. And I knew. I knew because she told me once on a visit, told me with her eyes more than her words, and I did nothing. I told myself I couldn't. Told myself if I spoke up, they'd dismiss me. And then who would translate the treaties? Who would make sure the words were right? Who would protect the people who needed accurate language between them and the men taking their land? His hand stopped. She walked into the river on a morning in March. The water was still half frozen. They found her a mile downstream. The fire popped. A log shifted and sent sparks into the still air. I don't help you because you're special, Eliza Mercer. Caleb's voice was steady, but the steadiness had a crack in it now, a fracture line running through stone. I help you because I was too young and too afraid to help you, and I swore on her name that I would never stand still again. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. The river moved. The horses shifted on the line. A magpie called from somewhere in the cottonwoods and received no answer. Then Eliza stood up. Teach me to ride. Caleb drove the scraping tool into the ground and walked to the rope line. He untied a dun-colored mare with a black mane and gentle eyes. This is Tashina. She's patient. You don't have to be. Eliza touched the mare's neck. The animal turned its head and pressed its nose against her shoulder. Warm breath on her skin, the smell of grass and dust, and something alive that didn't want to hurt her. Get on, Caleb said. Eliza grabbed the mane, put her foot where he pointed, and pulled herself up. Her legs shook. Her balance was wrong. She gripped so hard her knuckles went white. Breathe, Caleb said. I'm breathing. No, you're surviving. Breathe. Eliza closed her eyes, drew in air, let it out slow. The mare shifted beneath her and her body adjusted without thinking. Good. Again tomorrow. Same time. She went back every day. Silas was gone. By the 4th morning, she could mount without help. By the 6th, she could hold a trot without grabbing the mane. Caleb didn't praise her. He corrected her firmly and without softness. Your knees are wrong. Heels down. I said heels. Stop thinking. The horse already knows what to do. Get out of her way. Eliza bit back every sharp reply that rose to her tongue. She fell twice, bruised her hips so badly she limped for 2 days. On the 7th visit, Caleb brought a faster horse, a lean paint with quick legs and a stubborn mouth. This one doesn't forgive mistakes, he said. Good, neither do I. He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction, then settled back. Eliza was learning to read that almost smile the way she'd learned to read Silas's rages, by the smallest movements, the things other people missed. She pushed the paint into a gallop. The horse fought her for the first 100 yards, then gave in when it realized she wasn't letting go. They flew across the meadow, and for 30 seconds, Eliza forgot about Silas and the contract and the 40 days and everything else. For 30 seconds, there was only speed and wind and the sound of hooves on hard ground and the feeling that the earth itself was moving beneath her. She pulled up laughing, actually laughing, a sound so foreign in her own ears that it startled her. Again, she said. Caleb was watching from the fence. Again. She rode until the paint was lathered and her legs were trembling. When she dismounted, her knees buckled, and she caught herself on the saddle horn. You held on too tight through the turn, Caleb said, handing her a strip of dried meat. Horse thought you were panicking. Tried to stop. At least somebody listens to me. The corner of his mouth moved again, closer to a real smile this time. Still not quite there. What's funny? Eliza asked. Nothing. He took the paint's reins and let it to water. It's just that my sister used to say the same thing, exact same words, every time the horses at the fort ignored her signals. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah without his voice changing. Eliza noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Some things you don't point at. You just let them exist. When Silas came home and saw Eliza limping, she told him she'd tripped carrying water from the well. He believed her, because he'd never once considered she was capable of anything other than obedience. That was his first real mistake. Saturday, Silas drove her to town again. Same routine, same grip on her arm, same silence from the street. But this time Eliza had a purpose. While Silas settled accounts at the feed store, she walked to the church. Martha Pruitt was hanging laundry behind the parsonage, a thin woman with nervous hands and eyes that jumped at sudden sounds. "Mrs. Pruitt!" Martha spun around, clothespin in her mouth. She took it out slowly. Her eyes went to Eliza's bruised wrist, then quickly away. "Can I help you, dear? I need a signed letter from your husband confirming no marriage ceremony was performed at Copper Bluff Church for Eliza Mercer and Silas Dorn, dated and witnessed." Martha's face drained of color. "Samuel won't do it. He's terrified of Silas." "Then don't tell Samuel. You keep the church records. You write the letter. You sign his name." Martha stared at her. "That's forgery. That's survival." The two women looked at each other across the clothesline. White sheets hung between them, moving in a breeze that smelled like dust and sage. Martha's eyes were wet. Her chin trembled. Eliza could see the war inside her. Fear against conscience. Self-preservation against the ghost of every woman Martha had watched get broken in this town. "I've seen the bruise on your wrist you cover with your sleeve," Eliza said. "I've seen the way you jump when a door slams. Samuel may not hit you with his fists, but he's breaking you just the same." Martha's hand went to her wrist. Instinct. The unconscious gesture of a woman who'd spent years hiding what everyone already knew. "I'll have it Thursday," Martha whispered. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just get out alive." That Tuesday, Caleb taught her to gallop in the north draw where bluffs rose high on both sides and the grass grew thick enough to muffle hoofbeats. When they stopped to water the horses, Caleb pulled a folded piece of paper from his saddlebag. Brown and cracked at the edges. A letter written in formal legal language with a signature and a judicial seal at the bottom. "I've been writing to a judge in Miles City," he said, "a man named Hargrove. He ruled against a rancher in Yellowstone County last spring for holding a contract woman against a voided agreement. He'll hear my case. If we get there before the 60 days expire, and if we bring the church letter and the original contract, Martha will have the letter by Thursday. Then we leave Friday, before sunrise." "Friday," Eliza's voice cracked. "That's 4 days. 137 miles. 5 days ride if we push hard. That puts us in Miles City with a week to spare. Silas will follow." "Yes." "He'll bring men." "Yes." "He might kill you." Caleb took the letter back and folded it into the saddlebag. He looked at her with those dark eyes that never flinched and never softened and never looked away. He might try. Wednesday night, Silas hit her again. He'd lost another cattle buyer. The herd was thinning. Money was draining out of his life like water through cracked wood, and the only thing he could still control was the woman sitting across from him at the table. He knocked her out of the chair with an open hand. "You're bad luck. Everything started going wrong when you showed up." Eliza tasted blood. She pressed her hand against the floor and pushed herself up to sitting. "Stay down," Silas said, standing over her. She stood up. He stared at her. Something flickered in his eyes, not anger this time. Confusion, the disorientation of a man who pushes a wall and feels it push back. "I said stay down." "No." The word hung in the air between them like a held breath. One syllable, 2 letters, the most dangerous word in any language when spoken by someone who has never spoken it before. Silas's face went red. His hand came up. But this time Eliza didn't close her eyes. She watched his fist the whole way, saw the gold ring catch the lamplight, felt the impact against her jaw, tasted the bright copper flood of blood in her mouth. And she smiled. She smiled because in 2 days she'd be on a horse riding east with a cowboy in a brown leather vest who'd given up everything he had to help her find a judge. She smiled because she knew something Silas Dorn didn't know. She smiled because for the first time in her life, the man hurting her was the one who was afraid. 60 days run out, she said through the blood. Won't change what's coming. Silas's hand froze midair. "What did you say?" "I said what I said." He grabbed her by the throat and shoved her against the wall. His fingers tightened. Black spots bloomed in her vision. But the smile stayed. And something in that smile, something proud and broken and absolutely unafraid, reached into Silas Dorn's chest and squeezed. He dropped her like she was made of hot iron. "You're crazy," he said. He backed away, wiping his hands on his shirt like he'd touched something diseased. "You've gone crazy." Eliza slid down the wall to the floor, gasping for air. "Maybe," she whispered. Silas grabbed the whiskey bottle and walked out the door. She heard him mount his horse and ride toward town. The hoofbeats faded into the night, and the cabin went quiet. Eliza sat on the floor for 10 minutes. Then she stood, went to her trunk, and packed her saddlebag. The contract went in first, then the riverstone, then a knife she'd taken from the kitchen drawer 3 weeks ago and hidden under a loose floorboard. She didn't pack the Bible. She didn't need promises anymore. She needed proof. Thursday morning, Martha Pruitt handed her a folded paper behind the church without a word, a letter on church stationery, dated, stamped with the parish seal, signed it in what Eliza recognized was Martha's careful imitation of her husband's handwriting, confirming that no marriage ceremony had been performed for Silas Dorn and Eliza Mercer at Copper Bluff Church or any location within the parish. "It's good," Eliza said. "It's a death sentence if he finds it." Eliza folded the letter and slid it into her skirt lining next to the contract. "Martha, come with me." Martha looked at her like she'd suggested jumping off a cliff. "To Miles City. You testify in person. The judge rules in my favor. Then you're free too." "I'm not. You're not what happy, safe." Eliza stepped closer. "I've been that woman, Martha, the one who covers the bruise and hangs the laundry and pretends the world isn't rotting around her." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I can't," she whispered. "You can. You just haven't decided to yet." Eliza squeezed Martha's hand once hard, then let go. "If you change your mind, the North Draw, before sunrise Friday." That night, somewhere in the saloon in Copper Bluff, Silas Dorn sat in a circle of lamplight and whiskey, and the gold ring on his hand turned and turned as he spoke. "That drifter's been seen near my property again. Holt spotted him on the river trail 2 days ago." Polk leaned forward. "You want us to ride out there?" "I want him gone, dead or gone. Don't matter which." Another voice from the table. "Can't just shoot a man, Dorn. Army's touchy about that since the treaty." Silas slammed his glass down. "Don't talk to me about treaties. I got rights. That's my land, my property, my wife." He said those last two words the same way. The same weight, the same meaning. Property, wife. No difference, no distinction. Just things he owned and things he'd paid for, and anyone who touched them deserved what came next. Nobody at the table disagreed. Nobody at the table had disagreed with Silas Dorn in years. That was the nature of small towns built on cattle money and fear. The man with the biggest fists set the rules, and everyone else learned to live inside them. But outside that saloon, on a road that led east toward open prairie, a cowboy was saddling 2 horses in the dark. And in a cabin 3 miles south, a woman was checking a saddlebag for the last time. The clock was running. 39 days. And tomorrow the cage door opened. Eliza left the cabin before the first bird sang. She moved through the dark and with her saddlebag over one shoulder and the kitchen knife tucked into her boot. She didn't look back at the cabin. She didn't close the door. She left it open the way you leave a grave, because you're done with what's inside. The North Draw was 2 miles north between bluffs that blocked the sight lines from the road. She walked by memory now. Her feet knew every dip, every rise, every patch of loose rock. Caleb was already there. 2 horses saddled, saddlebags packed, a rifle and a leather scabbard strapped to his horse. He stood beside the dun mare adjusting a cinched strap, and he looked up when Eliza came through the gap in the bluffs. He was wearing the blue work shirt and the brown leather vest, same as always, and his hat was pulled low against the pre-dawn cold. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask if she was ready. He looked at her face, the fresh bruise on her jaw from Wednesday night, and his hand stopped moving on the strap. "He do that last night, Wednesday? You should have left Wednesday. I needed the church letter." Caleb pulled the cinch tight and handed her the mare's reins. "You have it." Eliza patted her skirt lining. "Contract, letter, both. Water, 2 canteens. Food, cornbread, dried beef, 3 days' worth if I ration." Caleb nodded. 5 days to Miles City. We'll hunt on the way." Eliza mounted the mare. Her body knew the motion now. Foot, grip, swing, settle. Caleb watched without comment, which was the closest thing to approval he ever gave. He mounted his own horse and turned east. "Stay close, don't talk unless you need to. Sound carries on flat ground." They rode out of the draw as the eastern sky turned from black to gray. Behind them in a cabin 3 miles south, Silas Dorn slept on. He wouldn't sleep much longer. They rode hard through the morning. The prairie opened up around them, endless and rolling, and Eliza felt the distance growing between herself and Copper Bluff like a rope stretching to its breaking point. Every mile was a mile farther from Silas's hands. Every hour was an hour closer to Miles City and a judge who might set her free. Caleb rode ahead, reading the ground with a skill Eliza couldn't follow. He chose trails that stayed below ridge lines. He followed creek beds when they could. He avoided high ground where riders could be seen for miles. By noon, Eliza's thighs burned and her back ached. She hadn't ridden this long or this hard before. The mare was patient, just like Caleb had promised. But Eliza's body wasn't. At a creek crossing, Caleb let the horses drink. Eliza slid off the mare and nearly collapsed. She caught herself on the saddle horn and stood there, legs trembling, pride keeping her upright. Caleb handed her a strip of dried meat without looking at her. "Eat. We ride again in 20 minutes. You're not much for comfort, are you? Comfort's what you had in that cabin. Look where it got you." Eliza bit into the meat and didn't argue. They were filling the canteens when Caleb froze. His head came up. His body went rigid the way an animal goes rigid when it hears something that human ears miss. "What?" Eliza whispered. "Horses, more than one, coming from the west." Her blood went cold. "How far?" Caleb pressed his hand flat against the ground, held it there for 3 seconds, then stood. 3 miles, maybe less. Moving fast. Silas. Probably. How did he? Holt, the blacksmith. He watches the roads at dawn. Must have seen us leave the draw. How many horses? Caleb listened again. 3, maybe 4. 4 men, armed men, drunk men, most likely riding on Silas's whiskey and Silas's rage, and the righteous fury of a man who believed he was chasing a thief because someone had stolen his property. "We can't outrun 4 horses, Eliza said. "No, but we can outthink them." Caleb grabbed both sets of reins and led the horses into the creek. "We ride in the water for a mile north. Creek bed's rocky, won't hold tracks. Then we cut east through the breaks. That adds a day. Being dead adds forever. Get on your horse." They rode through the creek in silence. The water was knee-deep on the horses. Cold. The current pulled at the mare's legs. Eliza gripped with her thighs and leaned forward the way Caleb had taught her. After a mile, Caleb turned east up a shallow bank into broken country. Ravines and dry washes cutting through clay hills. Hard ground that wouldn't hold prints. He rode like the land was a language he'd been reading since birth. They rode until dark. Caleb made a coal camp in a shallow ravine. No fire, no light. They ate cornbread and dried beef in darkness. "Will they track us at night?" Eliza asked. "Silas won't. He can't read ground." Caleb left the sentence unfinished. "But if he brought someone who can, then we ride harder tomorrow." They slept in shifts. Eliza took first watch, sitting with the knife across her knees, listening to the prairie wind and the far-off cry of coyotes. When Caleb woke her at midnight, his hand on her shoulder was gentle. "Anything, nothing. Good. Sleep. Tomorrow we ride harder." Dawn brought trouble. Caleb shook her awake while the sky was still purple. "Up, now!" "What is it?" "Dust clouds, southwest. They found the creek crossing and picked up our trail." "How close?" 2 hours. Maybe less if they're pushing." Eliza was on her horse in under a minute. Caleb didn't have to tell her to be fast anymore. They rode east at a hard gallop. The broken country gave way to rolling plains, open, exposed, nowhere to hide. The mare was strong but not fast. The miles blurred. Eliza's body screamed at her, every muscle, every joint, every bruise Silas had given her, throbbing in rhythm with the horse's stride. She didn't slow down. At mile 18, the mare stumbled. Eliza lurched forward, grabbed the mane, pulled herself back. The mare recovered, but her stride shortened. She was tiring. "She can't keep this pace," Eliza called to Caleb. 2 more miles." Caleb pulled up and circled back. He looked at the mare's legs, her breathing the way she favored her left front. "Switch horses." He dismounted and helped Eliza onto his horse, a bigger, stronger animal with longer legs. He took the mare's reins and mounted her. "Caleb, she's too tired for your weight." "I'll walk her if I have to. You ride ahead. Flat Rock is due east. You'll see chimney smoke from the ridge. A man named Desmond. He owes me a life." Eliza's chest tightened. I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me. You're riding ahead. I'm right behind you. That's the same thing. It's not. He turned the mare and looked at her, the blue shirt sweat dark across the shoulders, the brown vest catching the morning light. If they catch me, they catch a cowboy on a tired horse. They can't prove anything. Silas's contract has my name nowhere on it. He'll kill you anyway. Maybe, but you'll be at Flat Rock with fresh horses and a 100-mile head start. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him no plan was worth his life. But she looked at his face and saw something she recognized. The same expression she'd worn when she told Silas no. The expression of a person who has already decided. Ride, Eliza. She rode. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than leaving the cabin. Harder than standing up after being hit. Harder than smiling with blood on her lips. Riding away from Caleb Slade while 4 men with guns closed the distance behind him was a kind of pain she didn't have a word for. She found Flat Rock by the chimney smoke, just like Caleb said. A low log building with a corral and the heavy-set trader named Desmond, who looked at her like she was something the wind blew in. Caleb sent me, Eliza said. Desmond leaned against the doorframe. Thick man, dark beard, skeptical eyes. Caleb Slade sends a woman on his horse. That's new. He needs fresh horses. 2, and he's got men behind him. Desmond straightened. How many? 3 or 4, armed. The trader looked past her toward the western horizon. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something harder. How far? An hour behind Caleb, maybe less. Desmond disappeared inside. He came back with a rifle and saddlebags. He whistled and a boy, maybe 13, brought 2 horses from the corral. A red roan and a buckskin, lean and alert, and built for distance. Water your animal and eat something. When Caleb gets here, you ride. What if he doesn't get here? Desmond loaded the rifle. Then I go get him. Eliza walked inside on legs that could barely hold her. She drank water, ate a handful of pemmican. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the cup. She stood at the window and watched the western horizon. Nothing. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Her throat closed. Her eyes burned. 20 minutes. Then dust. A single rider. Slow. The mare limping but moving. A blue shirt and a brown vest visible even at a distance because some things you learn to recognize, the way you recognize your own heartbeat. Caleb Slade rode the mare into the yard and slid off. The animal was lathered and blowing hard, but he was unharmed. They stopped, he said. Eliza was standing in the doorway, and her hands were still shaking, but her voice was steady. Why, Ma? 3 miles back, I watched from a ridge. Desmond came out with the rifle over his shoulder. Why'd they stop? Caleb took the water cup Eliza held out and drank it dry. Deputy Garrett. Eliza went still. The deputy is with them. Not with them, behind them, riding separate. Must have come from town after Silas left. Caught up on the trail. Stopped them. For what? I couldn't hear, but Silas was screaming and Garrett wasn't moving. Desmond spat in the dirt. Deputies either stopping them or joining them. Either way, you don't want to be here when they decide. They switched to the fresh horses. The roan and the buckskin were alert and eager, a world of difference from the spent mare. They rode east fast. The fresh horses ate up the miles. By sundown, they'd covered 30 miles. Caleb found a sheltered hollow near a dry wash. Cold camp again. No fire. Whispered conversation. Deputy Garrett, Eliza said. Is he Silas's man? Garrett follows the badge, not the money. Then why was he with Silas? He wasn't with Silas. He was following Silas. There's a difference. Eliza chewed on that. You think Garrett knows about the contract? I think Garrett knows more than anyone in Copper Bluff gives him credit for. He's been in that town 6 months. He's seen how Silas operates. Men like Garrett keep quiet until they have enough to act, or until someone forces their hand. So he could help us. Or he could arrest you for running from a legal contract. That's not reassuring. Truth usually isn't. They rode through the night, stars so thick the sky looked like someone had broken open a lantern and spilled the light across heaven. Caleb rode beside her, silent, watchful, his head turning every few minutes to check the western horizon. Nothing followed. At midnight, they stopped to rest the horses. Eliza sat on the cold ground with her back against a rock and the knife across her knees and the river stone in her pocket pressing warm against her thigh. Caleb. Hmm. What happens if the judge rules against me? He was quiet for a long time. Then he lay back against his saddle and looked at the sky. Then I take you somewhere Silas Dorn will never find you. That's not a legal solution. No, it's a human one. She thought about that, about what it meant, about the man lying 3 feet away from her in the dark, a cowboy in a worn leather vest who had lost his sister to a system that traded women like horses and had spent every year since trying to balance a ledger that would never come even. We should keep moving, she said. We should. Neither of them moved. The stars turned overhead. Somewhere on the dark prairie behind them, Silas Dorn was either sitting in a jail cell or riding hard in their direction. And somewhere ahead, 100 miles east, a judge sat in a brick courthouse with the power to set her free or send her back. Eliza closed her eyes, not to sleep, to count. 32 days left on the contract. She only needed 5 more miles of dark road. 5 more days of sore muscles and cold food, and the steady sound of hooves on hard ground. 5 more days of riding beside a man who had stepped forward when the whole world stood still. She opened her eyes. Let's go. Caleb was already on his feet. They mounted in silence and rode east, 2 riders against a sky full of stars, the prairie opening before them, like a promise that hadn't been broken yet. They saw Miles City at dawn on the 5th day, a dark line cutting across the eastern horizon. Rooftops, a church steeple, a water tower standing against the pale sky like a sentinel that had been waiting for them since they left Copper Bluff. Eliza squinted against the early light and her vision blurred, and she realized she was crying. Not sobbing, not breaking down, just tears running silently down her dust-caked cheeks while her hands held the reins steady and her spine stayed straight. How far? She asked. 3 miles, maybe 4. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. And let's finish it. They rode the last miles at a walk. The horses were spent, lathered, blowing, heads low, moving on nothing but heart. Eliza leaned forward and pressed her hand against the buckskin's neck. Almost, she whispered. Miles City came into focus slowly, bigger than Copper Bluff. 2 main streets, a railroad depot with a steam engine sitting on the tracks like a sleeping iron animal. A courthouse built from real brick with a wooden sign and an American flag hanging limp in the windless morning. Businesses with glass windows and painted signs. People moving along boardwalks. Wagons rattling through the intersections. A real town. A town with law. They tied the horses at a water trough near the depot. Eliza slid off the buckskin and her knees buckled. Caleb caught her elbow and held her upright until her legs remembered how to work. His grip was firm, but not hard. The difference between a hand that holds you up and a hand that holds you down. She'd spent 6 weeks learning to tell the difference. Courthouse, she said, you need to eat first. Courthouse. Caleb looked at her face. The dust, the tears, the bruise on her jaw fading to yellow. The set of her mouth that said she'd ridden 137 miles and she wasn't stopping for a biscuit. All right, he said. They walked up the main street. People stared. A woman in a torn dress walking beside a cowboy in a blue work shirt and a brown leather vest with an eagle feather tied to his wrist. Miles City had seen strange things rolling in off the prairie, but this drew eyes. Eliza didn't notice. She was looking at the courthouse. Brick walls, wooden steps, a sign that read Territorial Court 6th Judicial District. The doors were open. She climbed the steps. Caleb stopped at the bottom. She turned. You're not coming in. A cowboy who drifts from town to town doesn't always get a fair hearing inside a courthouse. You will. I'll make sure of it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he climbed the steps. They walked inside together. The courthouse was quiet. A clerk sat behind a desk near the entrance, sorting papers. Young man with ink-stained fingers and a collar that was too tight. He looked up, saw Eliza's condition, saw Caleb, and his eyes went wide. Can I help you? I need to see Judge Hargrove, Eliza said. The judge doesn't take walk-ins. You'll need to file a... I've ridden 5 days from Copper Bluff with a voided marriage contract and a church letter proving fraud. I've been beaten, dragged, and hunted across 137 miles of open prairie By a man who thinks he bought me for $200. She took one step closer to the desk. I will see Judge Hargrove today. The clerk's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Wait here. He disappeared through a door behind his desk. 2 minutes later, the door opened and a man walked out. Judge William Hargrove was not what Eliza expected. Short, round-faced, wire spectacles perched on a nose that had never been broken. Soft hands that had never held a rope or swung a hammer. He looked like a school teacher who'd wandered into the wrong profession and decided to stay. But his eyes were something else entirely. Quick, sharp, the kind of eyes that saw through bluster and through silence and straight down to bone. He looked at Eliza, then at Caleb, then back at Eliza. You're the one from Copper Bluff. You know about me. Caleb Slade wrote me 3 weeks ago. I've been expecting you, though I'll admit I expected you to arrive in somewhat better condition. He gestured to the door behind the clerk. Both of you, come in. Hargrove's chambers were small, a desk buried under papers, 2 chairs with worn leather seats, bookshelves lined with territorial law volumes whose spines were cracked from actual use. He sat behind the desk and put on his spectacles. Sit. Eliza sat. Caleb stood by the door. Hargrove glanced at him but didn't press it. Some men stood because they were restless. Some stood because they'd learned that the spot nearest the exit was the safest place in any room. Show me what you have. Eliza pulled the contract and the church letter from her skirt lining and laid them on the desk. The papers were creased, sweat-stained, worn soft from 5 days pressed against her body. But the words were legible. The ink had not run. The clauses were intact. Hargrove read the contract first, slowly. His finger traced the clauses the way a man traces a map he's studied before but wants to be certain about. He stopped on Clause 7. 60-day fulfillment clause, he murmured. Standard language for broker contracts out of St. Louis. He looked up. How many days since your arrival? 32, 28 remaining. And no marriage ceremony was performed. None, the letter confirms it. Hargrove read the church letter. He held it close to the lamp on his desk. His eyebrows drew together. This signature. Samuel Pruitt. Eliza's pulse spiked, but her face didn't change. 5 days on the trail had taught her that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yes. I've seen Reverend Pruitt's signature before. He testified in a land dispute case last year. Hargrove set the letter down. He removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This isn't his hand. The room went cold. Caleb shifted by the door. Liza could feel his tension without looking at him. Who wrote this letter, Miss Mercer? Eliza's mind raced. She could lie, protect Martha, claim she didn't know. But she looked at the judge's face, those sharp eyes behind the wire spectacles, and knew that lying to this man would end everything she'd fought for. His wife, Eliza said. Martha Pruitt. She wrote it because her husband was too afraid of Silas Dorn to sign his own name. Hargrove set the letter down. A forged church document is inadmissible in territorial court. Eliza felt the room tilt. 5 days of riding, bruises, blood, Caleb's sacrifice, Desmond's horses, the sleepless nights, the cold camps and the coyotes and the dust cloud on the western horizon. All of it crumbling because a frightened woman's handwriting didn't match her husband's. However, Eliza looked up. The content of the letter, the assertion that no marriage was performed, can be independently verified through church records, witness testimony, and the absence of a marriage certificate filed with the territory. He put his spectacles back on. Is there a filed marriage certificate for you and Silas Dorn? No, Silas never filed anything. He didn't think he needed to. He didn't. That was his error. Hargrove pulled a blank form from his desk drawer. Under territorial law, a marriage broker contract establishes intent, not union. Without a performed ceremony and a filed certificate, the contract is a commercial agreement, not a marriage. He began writing, quick, precise strokes. I'm issuing a preliminary ruling. The contract between Eliza Mercer and Silas Dorn is suspended pending full review. You are not legally bound to return to Mr. Dorn's property, and any attempt by Mr. Dorn to compel your return will be treated as unlawful detention. He signed the form and stamped it with his seal, held it out to her. Eliza took it with both hands. Suspended isn't voided, she said. No, a full voiding requires a formal hearing. Both parties present, evidence reviewed. I'll schedule it for 2 weeks from today. Silas will come here. I certainly hope so. I have questions for Mr. Dorn about his interpretation of territorial marriage law. Eliza pressed the paper against her chest. Thank you. Hargrove looked past her to Caleb, who hadn't moved from his spot by the door. Slade, your letter was well written, thorough. If you ever want to practice law in this territory, come see me. Something crossed Caleb's face. Not quite amusement, not quite pain. I've worked for the government before, Judge. Didn't agree with me. This isn't the government. This is justice. Sometimes they overlap. Caleb said nothing, but he inclined his head just slightly, a gesture Eliza recognized as the closest thing to respect he gave easily. They walked out into the morning sun. Eliza stood on the courthouse steps holding the court order and breathing air that tasted different, cleaner, lighter. Like someone had lifted a stone off her chest that she'd been carrying so long, she'd forgotten it was there. We did it, she said. Not yet. Suspension isn't freedom. The hearing is. But he can't touch me. The court says so. Paper says a lot of things. Silas Dorn doesn't read much. Eliza folded the order and slipped it into her skirt lining. 3 documents now. Her entire life reduced to paper and ink and a judge's seal. They found shelter with a woman named Nora on the east side of town. She was tall, middle-aged with gray streaks in dark hair and hands roughened by decades of hard work. She'd been married to a trader who died 2 years back and had kept the house going on her own since. She took one look at Eliza and Caleb on her doorstep and opened the door without a word. She fed them venison stew and cornbread and coffee so strong it could have stripped paint off a fence post. Eliza ate 3 bowls. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been full. Couldn't remember the last time she'd sat at a table where no one was going to hit her for eating too slow or too fast or looking the wrong direction while she chewed. Nora gave her a clean dress, plain brown and too big in the shoulders, but clean. Eliza changed in the back room and caught sight of herself in a small mirror on the wall. She barely recognized the woman looking back. Thinner, harder, sunburned across the nose and cheeks, her hair matted and tangled from 5 days of riding, the bruise on her jaw fading to yellow-green at the edges. But her eyes were different. Something in them had changed. Something Silas's fists had never reached and never could. She looked like a woman who had decided to live. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed slower than the 5 days on horseback. Every morning, Eliza sat at Nora's kitchen table with the contract spread in front of her, memorizing every clause, every word, every loophole Silas had been too arrogant or too drunk to notice. Caleb sat across from her, translating legal language into plain speech, testing her the way a man sharpens a blade. Steady, patient, relentless. What does Clause 3 say? The bride agrees to fulfill domestic obligations as defined by the contracting party. And what does that mean in court? It means Silas defined the terms of labor, not marriage. A judge can argue it reads more like an employment contract than a marital agreement. Good. Clause 7. 60-day fulfillment window. No ceremony performed. No certificate filed. The contract is reviewable and voidable. And the church records. No marriage logged in the Copper Bluff Parish Register for Eliza Mercer and Silas Dorn. Hargrove can subpoena those records directly. Caleb nodded. You're ready. I've been ready since he hit me off that wagon. One afternoon, Caleb showed her how to present evidence to a judge. They sat on Nora's porch, him in the chair with the blue shirt unbuttoned at the collar and the brown vest draped over the railing, and he walked her through it the way he'd once walked officers through treaty language at Fort Laramie. Don't look at Silas. Look at the judge. And if Silas starts yelling, let him. Every time that man opens his mouth, he ties his own noose tighter. Eliza considered this. Where did you learn that? Fort Laramie. I translated for men who had every right to scream but chose to stay silent. And they won. Not because the system was fair, but because silence in a courtroom is louder than rage. On the 3rd day, Eliza walked to the courthouse alone and asked the clerk, a young man named Wilkins, who'd grown oddly sympathetic since her first visit, for access to the territorial filing records. She wanted to confirm what she already knew. The filing ledger for Custer County, June 1874. July 1874. Names and dates. Marriages filed, recorded, sealed. She ran her finger down every entry. No entry for Dorn and Mercer. Can you write me a certified statement confirming this absence? She asked. Wilkins looked nervous. That's unusual. It's evidence. Wilkins disappeared into Hargrove's chambers and came back with the signed authorization. I'll have it ready tomorrow. Every document was another brick in the wall between herself and Silas Dorn. Eliza intended to build it so high he'd never climb over. On the fifth day, Deputy Owen Garrett rode into Miles City. Eliza was at the window when she heard a horse stop at the front gate. She walked outside and saw Garrett dismounting. Dust-covered, road-worn, a lean man in his mid-40s with a sun-weathered face and tired eyes that missed nothing. Badge on his chest catching the afternoon light. Deputy? Garrett tipped his hat. Miss Mercer. He tied his horse and stood at the gate, not crossing onto the property. Respectful, formal, the posture of a lawman who had already decided that what happened next mattered. Silas Dorn is in Miles City, Garrett said. Eliza's stomach tightened. When rode in this morning, he's at the Drover's Hotel with Polk and a man I don't recognize. Hired lawyer from Billings, I'd guess. Just those three. The others turned back after I stopped them on the trail. I arrested two of them for carrying weapons with intent to harm, released them after they agreed to ride home. Garrett paused. Silas was unhappy about that. I imagine so. He filed a counterclaim with the court, kidnapping and theft of property. Eliza's hands went cold. Property, oh. He's calling the horses property, the ones from Desmond's trading post. His lawyer will argue Caleb stole them to facilitate your abduction. Those horses belong to Desmond. Silas's lawyer will argue otherwise. It's a weak claim, but it muddies the water. Eliza leaned against the fence post. The weight pressed down on her. Not fear exactly, but the grinding exhaustion of fighting a man who had money and rage in a system that had been built brick by brick to protect men like him. Will you testify? She asked. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands. His fingers moved along the brim the way a man's fingers move along something he's held so long it's become part of his body. I came to Miles City to file my own report with the court, he said, detailing what I observed in Copper Bluff over the past 6 months. The public beating upon your arrival. Silas's pattern of abuse witnessed by multiple citizens. The armed pursuit across open territory. His stated intent to use violence. Eliza's breath caught. You documented all of that. I've been documenting it since the day you stepped off that wagon. She stared at him. The anger came fast and hot, and she didn't try to stop it. Why didn't you stop it then? That first day, you were there. Garrett put his hat back on. His jaw tightened. The lines around his eyes deepened, and she saw it there in the creases of his face, the thing he'd been carrying since that Tuesday in July. Guilt. The particular kind of guilt that belongs to men who watch wrong things happen and tell themselves they're waiting for the right moment to act. A deputy in a town owned by cattle money doesn't stop a beating by stepping in front of it, he said. He stops it by building a case strong enough that no judge can ignore it. People were building cases while I was being beaten. Yes, and I'm sorry for that. More than I know how to say. The anger flared, then it settled. Not gone, but rearranged. She looked at Garrett's face, the guilt, the tightness around his mouth, and she recognized a man who had been at war with himself for weeks and had finally chosen a side. Your testimony could end this, she said. I know. Then be in that courtroom. I will. He mounted his horse. One more thing. Silas has been drinking since he got here. Heavy, talking loud in the hotel bar, telling anyone who'll listen he's going to drag you back to Copper Bluff in chains. Let him talk. Talk turns to action when a man's drunk enough. Watch yourself. He rode toward the courthouse. Eliza watched him go and felt the wall grow one brick higher. On the 8th day, something happened that Eliza didn't expect. She was walking back from the general store when a woman stepped out of the telegraph office and blocked her path. Martha Pruitt. Eliza stopped dead. Martha looked different, thinner, hair pulled back tight, a carpet bag in one hand. Her left eye was bruised purple and swollen, half shut. Martha. Samuel found the church stationery. Martha's voice was flat, stripped of everything except fact. He counted the pages, found one missing, put it together. Eliza reached for Martha's arm. He did that to your face. He did that. Then he told me I'd burn in hell for forgery. Then he locked me in the root cellar. Martha's chin trembled once, then steadied, the way a cracked wall steadies before it either holds or falls. I broke the lock with a shovel, walked to the telegraph office, sent a wire to the territorial court requesting to testify as a witness. Eliza's eyes burned. Martha, I didn't come here for you. Martha's voice cracked, then hardened, like hot iron dropped into cold water. I came here because I've been that woman, the one who gets hit and says nothing, the one who covers the bruise and hangs the laundry and pretends the world isn't rotting around her. I've been her for 11 years. She set the carpet bag down on the boardwalk. I'm done being her. Eliza pulled Martha into her arms. The preacher's wife shook, rigid in the embrace, trembling with a fury that had been locked in a root cellar for over a decade and had finally broken free. You can stay with us, Eliza said. Nora has room. I can pay my way. Nobody's asking you to pay. That night, 4 people sat around Nora's kitchen table. Eliza, Caleb, Martha, Nora. 4 people from different worlds eating stew and cornbread, not speaking much, but occupying the same space with the easy quiet of people who understand what survival costs. Martha's testimony changed everything. She could confirm firsthand that no marriage ceremony had been performed. She could testify to Silas's abuse as a direct witness. She could describe the fear that kept an entire town silent, and she could explain why she'd forged the letter. Hargrove will ask about the forgery, Caleb warned. Let him, Martha said. I'll tell the truth. Samuel was too much of a coward to sign his own name, so I signed it for him. If that makes me a criminal, then I'm a criminal who did the right thing. Caleb looked at Eliza across the table. She reminds me of someone. Eliza almost laughed. The sound was strange in her own mouth, like a language she'd forgotten and was only now beginning to remember. The night before the hearing, Eliza sat on Nora's porch in the dark holding the riverstone. The air was warm and still. Somewhere in town, Silas Dorn was drinking himself into a rage in a hotel room, rehearsing the lies and threats he'd deliver tomorrow. Caleb came out and sat beside her. Not close, not far. The exact distance he always maintained, present without pressing. Nervous, he asked. Terrified. Good. Terrified people don't make careless mistakes. What if the judge sides with Silas? What if the lawyer from Billings is smarter than we are? Then I take you somewhere Silas Dorn will never find you. You can't keep running for me, Caleb. I'm not running. I already told you that. He looked at her in the darkness. But I'll answer your question honestly. If the judge sides with Silas, I'll fight it. If fighting fails, I'll take you somewhere safe. And if someone tried to stop me, I'll stand in their way. Why? You know why. I want to hear you say it. The silence stretched. Night insects sang. The horses shifted in Nora's yard. Because you're the first person who made me believe my sister's death wasn't for nothing, Caleb said. Because every time you stand up, she stands up. And because I am tired of watching good people get crushed by men who confuse ownership with love. Eliza pressed a stone against her chest. I'm scared of what I feel for you. You should be. It's going to make everything harder. I know, but not impossible. She reached out in the dark and found his hand. His fingers closed around hers. Rough, warm, strong. The hands of a man who had spent his whole life working and losing and getting back up and starting over. They sat there until the stars began to fade. Then Caleb squeezed her hand once and let go. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow. The courthouse was full. Word had spread through Miles City the way word always spreads in small western towns, fast, inaccurate, and irresistible. A mail-order bride was challenging her contract in territorial court. People had come to watch, men in suits, women in bonnets, cowboys who should have been working cattle. The reporter from the Yellowstone Journal with his pencil behind his ear and a notebook he'd already half filled. Eliza walked in wearing Nora's brown dress, her hair pinned back, her face clean, her bruises unhidden. She didn't cover them. She wanted every person in that room to see what Silas Dorn's definition of marriage looked like. Caleb walked beside her. Blue work shirt, brown leather vest, hat in his hands. Martha walked behind. Nora stood at the back of the room near the door, arms crossed, face set in the expression of a woman who had seen plenty of fights and intended to see this one through to the end. Silas was already seated at the opposite table. Eliza saw him, and her body reacted before her mind could override it. Hands cold, throat tight, ribs aching in the exact places his boots had found them. 6 weeks of muscle memory, 6 weeks of flinching. Then she looked at his face, red-eyed, unshaved. His black hat was off, and without it, he looked smaller, shrunken. The man beside him, the Billings lawyer, a thin man named Mercer with a sharp face and an expensive coat, was whispering urgently in his ear. Silas's eyes found Eliza across the room. He smiled. That smile. The same one he'd worn while dragging her across the boardwalk in Copper Bluff, while telling 40 people she was damaged goods, while raising his hand with the gold ring that had split her lip open on the first day of what he called a marriage. And Eliza felt the last trace of fear leave her body the way smoke leaves a chimney. Rising, thinning, gone. She sat down, placed the contract and the court documents on the table, folded her hands. All rise. Judge Hargrove entered, sat, put on his spectacles, looked at Eliza, looked at Silas, looked at the packed courtroom. This is a contract dispute hearing, not a circus. I will have order or I will have an empty room. Those are your choices. He turned to Mercer. State your client's claim. Mercer stood, smooth, confident, every word measured and placed like bricks in a wall he'd built 100 times before. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Silas Dorn entered into a lawful marriage broker contract with Miss Eliza Mercer in good faith. He paid $200 for the arrangement. Miss Mercer abandoned his property in the company of a drifter named Caleb Slade, who we allege facilitated her unlawful departure and theft of livestock. Hargrove looked at Eliza. Your response? Eliza stood. No lawyer, no advocate, just a woman in a borrowed dress with bruises on her face and 5 days of prairie dust still under her fingernails. I was bought, Your Honor, not married. Mr. Dorn paid a broker in St. Louis for my transport to Copper Bluff. Upon arrival, he beat me in public view. He never arranged a marriage ceremony. He never filed a marriage certificate. He never fulfilled the terms of Clause 7 of the contract, which requires the completion of Christian marriage within 60 days. She placed the contract on the judge's bench. This contract is a commercial transaction, not a marriage, and I am not property. The courtroom was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who don't know what to say. The electric silence of people who are hearing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Hargrove read the contract. He read the certified statement from Wilkins confirming no marriage certificate on file. He read Deputy Garrett's sworn report, which Garrett had filed 2 days earlier. Then he looked at Mercer. Mr. Mercer, is there a filed marriage certificate for your client and Miss Mercer? Mercer hesitated. A small hesitation barely visible, but in a courtroom. Hesitation is a confession. The marriage was implied by the contract, Your Honor. Implied. Hargrove removed his spectacles. Mr. Mercer, I have practiced territorial law for 31 years. In that time, I have never once seen a marriage implied into existence. Marriage is performed or it is not. Was a ceremony conducted? Mercer looked at Silas. Silas's smile was gone. My client intended to. I didn't ask about intentions. Was a ceremony conducted, yes or no? No, Your Honor. Were vows exchanged? No. Was a licensed minister present? No. Then there is no marriage. Hargrove put his spectacles back on, which brings us to Clause 7. He read the clause aloud. Every word. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that Eliza could hear the reporter's pencil scratching on paper, could hear the creak of the wooden benches, could hear her own heart beating steady and strong in a chest that no longer felt like a cage. The evidence before me suggests that Mr. Dorn had no intention of fulfilling the marriage requirement, Hargrove said. He treated the contract as a completed transaction. He publicly abused Miss Mercer beginning on the day of her arrival. He pursued her across open territory with armed men when she departed. He looked at Silas. Mr. Dorn, do you wish to address the court? Silas stood up. Mercer grabbed his arm. Silas shook him off. She's mine. I paid for her $200. That drifter stole her from me like she was cattle. Mr. Dorn, I don't care what your paper says, Judge. I bought her fair and square. Every man in Copper Bluff will tell you the same. Every man in Copper Bluff watched you beat this woman and said nothing. Hargrove's voice was quiet, but it carried the way a rifle shot carries across open ground, clean and final. That is not a character reference, Mr. Dorn. That is a confession of communal failure. Silas's face went dark. His hands balled into fists at his sides. The gold ring caught the lamplight. You walk out of this courtroom, he said, pointing at Eliza, and I'll find you. I don't care where you go. Mr. Dorn, you are threatening a protected party in a court of law. One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt. Contempt? Oh, Silas laughed. A hard, ugly sound that bounced off the brick walls and came back sounding worse. I got nothing but contempt for this whole bailiff. Two men stepped forward. Silas looked at them, then at the judge, then at Eliza. And Eliza stood at her table with her hands flat on the wood and looked directly into Silas Dorn's eyes. Those eyes that had been the last thing she'd seen before his fist connected every night for 6 weeks. Those eyes that had looked at her the way a man looks at something he bought and doesn't like and can't return. She looked into those eyes and she spoke. You didn't buy a wife, Silas. You bought your own undoing. And I'd pity you if I had any left to spare. Silas lunged. The bailiffs caught him. Mercer grabbed his arm. The courtroom erupted. Voices, chairs, scraping. Somewhere a woman screamed. The reporter's pencil broke. Hargrove slammed his gavel 3 times. The sound was like gunshots. Order. The room settled. Silas was held between 2 bailiffs, breathing hard, face flushed, eyes wild. The gold ring glinted under the courtroom lamps. Hargrove stood. In the matter of the broker contract between Silas Dorn and Eliza Mercer, I rule as follows. The contract is void. No marriage was performed. No certificate was filed. The terms of Clause 7 were not fulfilled. Miss Mercer is a free woman under territorial law, bound to no party and entitled to full protection of this court. He turned to Silas. Mr. Dorn, you are hereby charged with contempt of court and threatening a protected party. You will be held in the Miles City Jail for 30 days. Upon release, you are prohibited from approaching Miss Mercer or contacting her by any means. Violation of this order will result in criminal prosecution. The gavel came down one final time. This hearing is concluded. The courtroom exhaled, not chaos, something closer to relief. A collective breath released by 50 people who had just watched a woman walk into a cage and walk out free. Eliza stood at the table. Her hands were shaking. Her legs were shaking. Everything was shaking. Martha grabbed her from behind and held her. Nora appeared and put a hand on her shoulder. Deputy Garrett stood near the side door with his hat in his hands and something on his face that might have been the beginning of peace. Caleb stood 2 feet away, arms at his sides, face unreadable. The blue shirt, the brown vest, the same stillness he'd carried since the first day she'd seen him at the end of a dusty street in Copper Bluff. Eliza looked at him through tears she couldn't stop and didn't try to. It's over, she said. It's over. The bailiffs dragged Silas out through a side door. He screamed Eliza's name once. The sound echoed off the brick walls and died the way all sounds die when nobody listens to them anymore. Nobody in the courtroom turned to look. They stayed in Miles City for 3 more days. Eliza filed the paperwork Hargrove required. She signed documents. She gave testimony for the official record. She did everything slowly, carefully, the way a person handles something fragile and new and almost too good to trust. On the 2nd day, a letter arrived from Copper Bluff, carried by a rider who'd come through Flat Rock. It was from Agnes Holden, the shopkeeper. 4 sentences, no greeting, no signature, just 4 lines of cramped handwriting on the back of a receipt. Dorn's ranch seized by the bank for unpaid debts. Holt closed the smithy and left town. Polk is drinking himself to death. Nobody talks about what happened, but nobody forgot. Eliza read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket next to the Riverstone. On the 3rd morning, she found Caleb in Nora's yard brushing the buckskin. The horse leaned into his hands the way animals lean into people they trust. The blue shirt was clean. Nora had washed it. The brown vest hung on the fence, drying in the morning air. "Where will you go?" Eliza asked. Caleb didn't look up. "Back to the river, I suppose." "To what? You traded your hides to Desmond. You've got nothing left." "I've got a horse, a tent, a rifle. That's more than most people I know." "That's not enough." "It's enough for me." Eliza walked to the fence and took the vest off the rail. She held it for a moment. The leather was soft from years of wear, shaped to his shoulders, creased at the elbows, where his arms bent darker at the back, where sweat and sun had stained it. It smelled like campfire smoke and horse, and the particular scent of a man who spent his life outdoors and had made peace with it. She held the vest out to him. "Put this on," she said. He looked at the vest, then at her. "There's a valley east of here," she said, "along the Yellowstone. I asked Nora about it. Good water, good grass. Enough land for a small ranch if someone was willing to work it. A ranch needs more than one cowboy. Then it's a good thing there's more than one person willing to work." Caleb took the vest. He put it on slowly, settled it on his shoulders. The leather creaked the way old leather creaks when it finds its shape again. "You don't owe me anything, Eliza." "I know. That's why I'm asking. Not paying, not contracting, not signing papers." She stepped closer. "I'm asking you to build something. With me. Not for me, not because of Sarah. Not because of guilt or obligation or some debt you think you haven't finished paying. Because you want to. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to stop sleeping in the dirt and start building a life. I've had enough of men who think owning something is the same as loving it. I want someone who knows the difference." Caleb looked at her for a long time. The morning light was in his face, and she could see every line and every scar and every year of hard living written in his skin. She could see the ghost of his sister behind his eyes the way ghosts live in the eyes of people who love them. Not haunting, just present, still there. "All right," he said. One word, quiet, simple. The most important word he'd ever spoken. They left Miles City that afternoon. Eliza, Caleb, Martha, who had nowhere to go back to and no intention of going there anyway. She rode Desmond's second horse with both hands on the saddle horn, cursing under her breath every time the animal broke into a trot. "This is miserable," Martha said. "You'll get used to it." "I will not. I said the same thing 3 weeks ago." Nora stood on her porch and watched them ride east. She raised one hand. Eliza raised hers. They rode 2 days to the valley Nora had described. It was everything she'd promised. A wide stretch of bottomland along the river. Cottonwood trees along the bank. Grass tall enough to brush the horses' bellies. Clean water running over smooth stones. Mountains in the distance, blue and steady, against the sky that went on forever. Caleb stood on a rise overlooking the valley and didn't speak for a long time. The wind moved through the grass in waves, and the river caught the late afternoon light and turned it to gold. "Good land," he said finally. "Good enough." He looked at her. The almost smile appeared. This time, for the first time, it didn't disappear. It stayed, small, quiet, real. The smile of a man who had stopped expecting good things and had just been proven wrong. Good enough. 2 months later, a rider arrived at the cabin they'd built near the river carrying a letter. Eliza opened it with Caleb standing beside her. It was from Judge Hargrove. The letter was brief. Silas Dorn had served his 30 days. He'd returned to Copper Bluff to find his ranch seized and his name worth less than the debt attached to it. He'd left Montana Territory entirely headed south. Destination unknown. The final paragraph read, "Miss Mercer, I am pleased to inform you that the broker contract has been permanently voided and all associated claims dismissed. You are in the eyes of territorial law, a free woman with no legal obligations to any party. I wish you well." Eliza read it twice. Then she folded it and held it against her chest. "He's gone," she said. "He's gone. It's really over." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was over the moment you stood up in that cabin and told him no." Eliza looked at the valley around them, the cabin with its new wood still pale and fresh, the corral Caleb had built with his own hands, Martha's small garden already sprouting green shoots along the south wall, the horses grazing by the river, the sound of the water running the way rivers always run, Steady, patient, unstoppable. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the river stone. The bare paw was worn smooth at the edges from weeks of her thumb rubbing across it. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, so small, so ordinary, and so impossibly heavy with everything it meant. Then she walked to the cabin door and set it on the step. Right where Caleb had set it, on another step in another life outside a cabin that had been a prison. But this time it wasn't a message that said, "I see you." It was a message that said, "I'm home." She straightened up and looked east, where the sun was coming up over the mountains and the sky was turning the color of everything that hadn't happened yet. Caleb's vest hung on a hook by the door. His blue shirt was visible through the window, draped over the back of a chair. On the porch rail, a magpie landed and cocked its head at her. Eliza Mercer, a woman no man would ever own again, stood in the doorway of a house she had built and watched the morning come in.